Hi there. Real quick before we jump into the episode. If you enjoy this episode, or any of the other episodes, be sure to give us a follow or subscribe. It would also be great if you shared it with a friend, or better yet, left a review so others can know how awesome it is. Thanks so much. And now, the episode.
Hey there, Press Starters, and welcome to the Press Start Leadership Podcast, the podcast about game-changing leadership, teaching you how to get the most out of your product and development team and become the leader you were meant to be. Leadership coaching and training for the international game industry professional. Now, let me introduce you to your host, the man, the myth, the legend, Christopher Mifsud.
Hey there, Press Starters, and welcome back to another awesome edition of the Press Start Leadership Podcast. On this week's episode, we'll be discussing best and next practices for production rituals in video game studios. How stand-ups, planning, retrospectives, and production hygiene create healthier and more effective game development teams. Why production rituals matter more than tools. Every video game studio has production rituals. Daily stand-ups, sprint planning, backlog grooming, retrospectives, sync meetings, documentation habits. Even the way teams communicate and chat or handle handoffs become ritualized over time. Most studios treat these rituals as process overhead, necessary but rarely examined, something you inherit, follow, and occasionally complain about. Over time, rituals either fade into background noise or calcify into rigid ceremonies that no longer serve the team. What I have learned over the years is that production rituals are not just process. They are cultural infrastructure. Rituals shape how teams communicate, how problems surface, how trust is built, and how learnings happen. Good rituals create rhythm, clarity, and safety. Bad rituals drain energy, waste time, and quietly erode morale. Teams often blame individuals or tools when the real issue is that their rituals no longer fit the reality of how they work. Game development is especially sensitive to this. It is cross-disciplinary, creative, technical, and long-running. Rituals that work for software teams do not always translate cleanly. Rituals that worked early in a project may fail later. Rituals that support one team may actually harm another. This podcast looks at best practices for core production rituals that still hold up, and next practices that modern studios are adopting as teams scale up, go remote, or face longer and more complex production cycles. The goal is not to prescribe a single process, but to help leaders and producers think more intentionally about the rituals they maintain and evolve. What production rituals are really for. Before talking about stand-ups, grooming, or retrospectives, it is important to understand what production rituals are actually meant to do. Production rituals exist to create shared understanding, surface problems early, coordinate across disciplines, build predictable rhythm, support learning and improvement, reduce uncertainty. They are not about control. They are not about reporting upward. They are not about compliance. When rituals drift away from these purposes, they become hollow. Why rituals break over time. Rituals usually fail for predictable reasons. The team grows, but the ritual does not change. The project phase shifts, but the ritual stays the same. Leadership stops participating meaningfully. Rituals become status theater. No one remembers why the ritual exists. Teams often keep rituals because changing them feels risky or exhausting. Over time, resentment builds quietly. Rituals as alignment mechanisms. In game studios, alignment is fragile. Designers, artists, programmers, producers, and QA all see the project differently. Rituals are one of the few places where these perspectives intersect regularly. A ritual that creates alignment reduces friction everywhere else. Actionable steps to reevaluate existing rituals. Ask what each ritual is supposed to accomplish. If no one can answer clearly, the ritual is already failing. Identify who the ritual serves. If it only serves reporting, reconsider it. Assess energy, not attendance. Presence is not equal engagement. Look for repeated frustration signals. Eye rolls are data. Treat rituals as experiments, not rules. They can and should evolve. Rituals should earn their place on the calendar. Daily stand-ups. Alignment without surveillance. Stand-ups are one of the most common rituals in game studios and also one of the most abused. The original intent of the stand-up is simple. Align the team, surface blockers, and coordinate work. Somewhere along the way, many stand-ups turn into daily status reporting or subtle micromanagement. Why stand-ups fail? Common failure modes include turning into performance theater, reporting to a lead instead of the team, too many people who do not need to be there, updates that are irrelevant to others, problem solving hijacking the meeting. When this happens, teams stop listening. Stand-ups and creative teams. Creative disciplines often struggle with stand-ups because progress is not always incremental or visible. Forcing artificial updates creates anxiety rather than clarity. Stand-ups must respect how creative work actually unfolds. Report and hybrid stand-ups. Remote teams add complexity. Async updates can help, but only if they maintain purpose. Actionable steps for effective stand-ups. Reframe the stand-up as a coordination tool. Updates should help others, not justify work. Ask collaboration-focused questions. What do you need help with matters more than what you did. Limit attendance to those who benefit. Observers dilute value. Time box aggressively. Long stand-ups lose focus. Move problem-solving offline. Use a stand-up to identify issues, not solve them. A good stand-up leaves the team clearer, not drained. Backlog grooming and planning. Creating shared understanding. Backlog grooming and planning are often treated as administrative chores. In reality, they are some of the most important alignment rituals in the studio. Good grooming creates shared understanding. Bad grooming creates rework, frustration, and wasted effort. Why grooming fails. Grooming often breaks down when items are vague or incomplete, cross-discipline impact is ignored, technical constraints are discussed too late, estimates are treated as commitments, only producers or leads participate. When grooming fails, execution suffers. Planning is conversation, not contract. Planning should create confidence, not fear. When plans are treated as promises, teams become defensive and risk-averse. Actionable steps for better grooming and planning. Ensure backlog items answer why, not just what. Context prevents misinterpretation. Involve all relevant disciplines early. Late surprises are expensive. Treat estimates as forecasts, not guarantees. Uncertainty should be acknowledged. Break work into meaningful chunks. Overly large items hide risk. Leave room for learning. Plans should adapt as reality changes. Good planning aligns expectations before work begins. Retrospectives. Learning without blame. Retrospectives are the most powerful ritual in a production system, and often the most neglected. When done well, retros drive continuous improvement. When done poorly, they become venting sessions or box-checking exercises. Why retrospectives fail? Retros often fail because psychological safety is missing, nothing changes afterward, blame sneaks in, feedback is too vague, leaders dominate the conversation. Teams quickly learn whether retros are worth their honesty. Retros as leadership mirrors. How leaders behave in retros tells teams whether learning is truly valued. Defensiveness shuts retros down instantly. Actionable steps for effective retrospects. Establish safety explicitly. No blame, focus on systems, not people. Limit scope, focus on a specific time box or issue. Turn insights into actions. 1 or 2 concrete changes beat 10 vague observations. Close the loop next time. Show what changed as a result. Rotate facilitation. Shared ownership increases trust. Retros should make the next cycle better, not just more discussed. Production hygiene. The invisible work that keeps teams healthy. Product hygiene is everything that keeps work flowing smoothly, but rarely gets celebrated. Documentation, pipelines, naming conventions, communication norms, technical debt, tool upkeep. When hygiene is ignored, problems accumulate silently. Why hygiene gets deprioritized. Hygiene work often loses to feature work because it is invisible, it feels unurgent, it is hard to quantify, it does not demo well. Over time, this creates friction everywhere. Hygiene as leadership responsibility. Leaders signal what matters by what they protect. If hygiene ever gets time, teams learn it is optional. Actual steps to improve production hygiene. Make hygiene visible. Track it along feature work. Allocate dedicated time. Hygiene cannot survive on leftovers. Create simple standards. Overly complex rules are ignored. Reward cleanup work. Recognition changes behavior. Review hygiene regularly. Debt compounds quietly. Healthy teams are built on invisible maintenance. Next practices. Evolving rituals for modern game studios. Best practices provide stability. Next practices provide adaptability. Modern game studios face challenges that older production models did not anticipate. Remote work, async collaboration, longer development cycles, and global teams require evolution. Examples of next practices. Studios are experimenting with async stand-ups using written updates, lightweight planning sessions, rolling retros instead of scheduled ones, discipline-specific rituals layered on top of shared ones, fewer meetings with clearer intent. The goal is not novelty, it is fit. Win the change rituals. Change rituals win, energy drops constantly, teams stop engaging, the project phase shifts, team composition changes, work patterns evolve. Actionable steps to experiment with next practices. Test changes in small scopes. Do not overhaul everything at once. Gather feedback explicitly. Silence is not agreement. Define success criteria. Know what improvement looks like. Be willing to revert. Not every experiment works. Document what you learn. Process evolution should be intentional. Modern rituals should support modern realities. Leadership's role in protecting and evolving rituals. Rituals degrade when leadership disengages. Teams notice immediately when leaders treat rituals as optional or unimportant. How leaders undermine rituals unintentionally. Leaders often skip rituals regularly, multitask during meetings, override outcomes without explanation, change priorities without context. This signals that rituals do not matter. Leadership as ritual stewards. Leaders do not need to run every ritual, but they must respect and protect them. Actionable steps for leaders. Show up consistently. Presence signals importance. Model desired behavior. Engagement sets the tone. Defend rituals against pressure. Do not sacrifice learning for speed. Empower teams to improve rituals. Ownership drives relevance. Intervene when rituals become harmful. Process should serve people. Rituals survive when leaders treat them as a living system. Final thoughts. Rituals as living systems, not checklists. Production rituals are not boxes to tick. They are living systems that shape how teams experience their work. When rituals are intentional, they create clarity, trust, and momentum. When they are neglected or misused, they quietly drain energy and morale. The best studios are not the ones with the most rituals. They are the ones with rituals that fit their people, their projects, and their realities. They revisit purpose, they evolve thoughtfully, they protect what works, and let go of what does not. As leaders, our responsibility is not to enforce process. It is to steward rhythm, to ensure that the way work happens supports the people doing it, to recognize when rituals need care, change, or removal. If you take one thing away from this, let it be this. Every recurring meeting, every ritual, every process should be able to answer a simple question. Who does this help and how? If that answer is unclear, it's time to evolve. All right, and that's this week's episode of the Press Start Leadership Podcast. Thanks for listening, and as always, thanks for being awesome.
Oh, hi. Man, the episode's over, but thanks for sticking around till the end. Be sure to check out more episodes in the playlist and new episodes every week on Monday. Follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to leave a review. Thanks again for being awesome.